In today's lens review, I'm going to be reviewing one of Canon's largest prime lenses, the Canon EF 500mm f4L IS II USM Lens. And I'm going to start right now. Released back all the way in 2011, this is one of the largest camera lenses that you can buy, and it has amazing potential for wildlife and sport photographers. But the question I've got is it worth buying over the 400mm f2.8 Mark II or the larger EF 600mm f4? Let's find out firstly by looking at the overall build quality and what you get inside the box. So first up is the build quality. Now, as you can imagine from a Canon L series lens, as well as a lens being this price point, you're gonna get amazing build quality. First up, you're getting a full metal construction, you've got weather sealing, you're pretty much getting everything that you can imagine from a prime lens. Now this lens has 16 elements in 12 groups, but what's quite nice is the lens optics are more evenly distributed than the previous version. Now this means it's a little bit easier to handhold, still quite difficult, but what's nice is all of the front elements aren't that heavy. The lens optics are a little bit more evenly distributed, so it is a little bit easier to carry, as well as it is a little bit easier to shoot handheld. Now you've got a whole bunch of customization with this lens. First up, you've got an autofocus to manual focus switch, as well as a focus limiter switch with 3 different modes. The first mode is full focus, the second mode is 3.7 to 10 meters, and then 10 meters to infinity. So depending on what you're focusing on, if you are having focus issues, which can sometimes happen in a low light environment, you can use that focus switch to get a little bit better autofocus if you're focusing close distance or further away. It really helps with certain wildlife and especially sports photography. Now you've also got an image stabilization switch which you can turn on and off, as well as 3 image stabilization modes. Mode 1 is for general use, kind of what I predominantly had it on. You've got mode 2, which is better for tracking subjects left to right, so motorsport if someone's running, or wildlife going from left to the right of the frame or up and down. And then you've got mode 3, which will only activate the image stabilization when you're actually half pressing the shutter button. So that helps if you're following a fairly erratic subject like a bird, for example, or for me, red squirrels. Sometimes I switched it to mode 3 to get slightly better tracking when it comes to photography. You've also got a really handy focus preset switch. Now what this does is you set it at a certain distance. So what you need to do is choose your distance, press the set button, making sure your focus preset is on. Then right at the front of the lens, you've got this small little switch, and basically every time you turn it or press one of these buttons, what it will do is it will activate to a certain focus distance. Now I had it on the minimum focus distance because I was very close to the red squirrels. What it allowed me to do is always focus to a certain distance. Now this can really help in certain environments, especially if you're always focusing at a set point. Again, not for everybody, but I did find it incredibly useful when photographing red squirrels. Now, due to the lens's size and front element, you're not going to be able to use a filter. So right at the back of the lens, you've got a small 52mm drop-in filter, which is really nice, and it's also weather sealed as well. In the middle of the lens, you've got your giant focus ring. Now this is really handy, it's a real nice size, and it's also quite precise as well, offering full-time manual focus. So it doesn't matter if you're in autofocus or manual focus, you can twist it to get the exact focus that you're after, especially if you're struggling, finding something, and you've got a nice shallow depth of field at f4, sometimes even slight movements means you're basically going to be out of focus. You can switch this to get the exact focus you're after, and because of its size, you can even use it in gloves, which is great if you're in a cold environment. So what do you get in the box? Well, actually you get everything you need, and even more than I was expecting. Firstly, the box is massive. When you open the box, you get a flight case or a hard case, which is lockable. So you've got a nice, safe place to store the lens, as well as if you're ever traveling. I know a lot of people are going to be using this, maybe traveling to the Arctic or traveling to Norway or even Scotland. You're going to be able to bring this lens with you, and you know it's going to be safe. If you are, bringing it on a plane or bringing it in the back of a car, you know the lens is going to be nice and secure. Something that I definitely was using throughout, as well as you can actually sit on it. So if you're sitting in a hide and there isn't a chair, for example, or you're laying on the floor, you want to get that nice shot, you can actually use it as a seat, which I think is quite a nice little feature. You've also got a gigantic lens hood, which is great for protection from the elements, as well as foreign objects, or even basically the sun, as well as you're getting a front and rear lens cap. The front cap is this fabric material, and to use it, you just need to flip the lens hood backwards and basically place it over the lens. So as you can see, you're getting everything you could possibly imagine with this lens, as well as amazing build quality. So because of that, I'm giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. So next up, let's talk about the all-important image quality. So I took this lens up to the Yorkshire Dales to photograph the iconic British species, the red squirrel. Now what I really like about this lens, firstly, it's a prime lens, so it offers an amazing aperture of f4, which gives you two major benefits over a zoom lens. The first up is obviously f4 means you can shoot at a lower ISO, so you're getting less grain in your images. Maximum, even in the lowest lit environment, I was shooting at around 4000 ISO, which compared to my fellow photographers that I went with, which had 150 to 600mm zoom lenses, they were shooting at roughly f6.3, they were shooting at around 6400 ISO, which means you are going to get less grain in your images versus a zoom lens. The other big benefit is that shallow depth of field. You're getting that beautiful background blur, which is possible on some zoom lenses, but with this prime lens, you're getting amazing background separation, which I think is really nice for isolating your subject. And I'm really happy with a lot of the images and video that I took with this lens. Now you also got great bokeh with a 9-bladed rounded aperture diaphragm. So you're getting that lovely bokeh balls. I was shooting sometimes directly into the sun, and you're getting a lovely, beautiful kind of melting away bokeh, which I think is amazing with this lens. But let's talk a little bit more scientifically and have a look at some graph images. So we go ahead and zoom into our first image, which is 500mm wide open at f4. We can see in the center, we're getting great sharpness and great amount of contrast, where the corners are a little bit softer, lacking a little bit of contrast, and they're also a little bit darker. So this lens definitely suffers from some vignetting. Then if we step down to f5.6, the sharpness in the center definitely increases a little bit, but the corners get dramatically better, which is a really good sign. Then if we go down to f8, they get even sharper as well as the center. And as you can see, that vignetting is pretty much disappeared at this point. And as you can see, we shoot at f11, it's a very similar story, all the way up to around f16, where diffraction starts taking shape. Then if we jump all the way to f32, we can see it is very soft. So if you do want to get the sharpest images with the best amount of background separation, I recommend shooting between f4 all the way to f8. And next up, let's look at distortion and vignetting. Now, what's really nice about this lens is there's very little distortion. It's a very flat profile, almost no barrel or pincushion distortion to be seen, which is kind of expected from a 500mm prime lens. But there is a little bit of vignetting. So we can see vignetting wide open at f4. We can push it to the corners in f5.6. And then if we jump all the way to f8, you can pretty much see that has disappeared. Then if we have a look at f11, there is pretty much no vignetting to be seen. Now we can remove that in vignetting in post if you go ahead and enable profile corrections, which I recommend. But what's really nice is there's no distortion. So a really good mark with this lens when it comes to the overall image quality. So overall, I think this lens offers amazing image quality, incredibly sharp, wide open at f4, as well as offering very little distortion and vignetting. Some vignetting at f4, but that's something you can definitely fix by turning on your peripheral illumination inside your camera. Now, the only major downside I could see with the image quality of this lens is the minimum focus distance. It can be quite restricting in some environments. With red squirrels, for example, sometimes they'd run right up close to you. You're not going to be able to photograph them. So in some situations, you do want to make sure that you're focusing on further distant subjects away, just so you're getting them in focus. That's the only thing I really found restricting with this lens when it comes to the overall image quality. But apart from that, I think this lens is tip top when it comes to the sharpness, chromatic aberration, pretty much anything you can imagine. You're going to get beautiful images with this lens. Doesn't matter what you point it at, if it comes to wildlife or even sport photography. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. Right, so let's have a look at the overall size and weight and compare it to a few other lenses that are on the market. Now, as you can imagine, a 500mm f4, this lens is not small and is not light. If you are after a small lightweight lens with a 500mm focal length, you're probably looking at a zoom. But because this lens offers an amazing aperture of f4, you've got to have some optics in there somewhere, and it ends up being really, really big and heavy. In fact, this does not fit in my camera bag. I had to carry it around with me everywhere, which was a little bit annoying sometimes, especially if you're carrying a lens and a tripod, you've got no hands-free, so it's very difficult to open doors or fences or climbing over anything. So if you are thinking for wildlife photography, it can be quite restricting, but you are going to get amazing images. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to compare it to three other lenses that are very similar. The Canon EF 400mm, the Canon EF 600mm, as well as the Sigma 500mm Sport. So first up is the Canon EF 400mm f2.8 Mark II. That comes in at 3.85 kilograms. This lens here, the Canon EF 500mm f4 Mark II, comes in at 3.19 kilograms. And the Canon EF 600mm f4 Mark II comes in at 3.92 kilograms. So out of the three Canon lenses, this is actually the lightest lens. And if we compare it to the Sigma 500mm Sport, that comes in at 3.31 kilograms. So this is actually the lightest lens on my list. And if we have a look at the size chart here to compare the sizes, you can see it's actually the second smallest. The only other smaller lens there is the 400mm f2.8. So out of all the lenses we're looking at today, this is actually probably the best for the size and weight. Sure, it's not small, but compared to other prime lenses, this is actually one of the smallest and lightest that you can buy. So if you are a photographer and you don't want to carry around a massive prime lens, this might be a contender, especially if you compare it to the other Canon lenses like the 400mm 2.8 or the 600mm f4. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 7 out of 10. Right, so let's talk about the all-important autofocus as well as image stabilization and what this lens was like for video. Now the autofocus on this lens was, as you expect, excellent. It did find some situations fairly struggling, so I was shooting sometimes directly into the sun and it did hunt a little bit or struggle to find the red squirrel. I did use the Canon EOS R5 on animal tracking as well as eye tracking. So I am, chucking a mirrorless lens at this lens. I'm not using a DSLR, so I am using a very fast camera, but I must say this lens did keep up with the autofocus. It wasn't the best autofocus I have ever used. It did hunt a little bit and it did struggle in some situations, but most of the shots and most of the situations, I was really happy with the overall autofocus. Now the image stabilization, very similar. Up to 4 stops of image stabilization, and that's great if you want to do handheld photography. I took this beautiful barn owl video, and this is all handheld. You can see very little shake. Now the autofocus definitely helps out at 500mm. Sure, it doesn't eliminate all shake, so I do recommend using a beanbag or a tripod to get rock steady shots. But if you are handholding this, the image stabilization can definitely compensate any major shaking. Not everything, but it does eliminate most of that kind of very rubbish shaking, which can ruin some video. So overall, I highly recommend using this lens for autofocus as well as image stabilization. Autofocus is not perfect, so I'm not going to give it the top marks, but I would still say it is very good when it comes to the overall autofocus as well as image stabilization. So overall, I'm going to be giving it a solid 9 out of 10. And last but not least is price. Now, because this lens is slightly older and some other lenses we're going to be comparing it to today are no longer being sold brand new, what we're going to do in today's video is we're just going to look at the second-hand value to work out of all of these lenses, which is the best value for money. Now, first up is the Canon EF 500mm f4 Mark II. This lens comes in second-hand around £4,750, and that's with all of the accessories as well as it being in reasonable condition. Next up is the Canon EF 400mm f2.8 Mark II. Do bear in mind there's a Mark III version as well as an RF version if you do want to buy a dedicated mirrorless lens. But this lens, second-hand, comes in around £7,500, so around £2,500 more than the 500mm. Next up is the EF 600mm f4 Mark II. Again, there's a Mark III version of that lens as well as an RF version if you do want to buy a mirrorless lens, but for the Mark II version, you're going to be looking at around £7,500. So again, around £2,500 more than the 500mm. And the last lens we're looking at today is the Sigma 500mm f4 Sport EF Fit, and that comes in around £2,500 second-hand, although this is one of the few lenses that's still available brand new, and the brand new price comes in at £4,699 at the time of making this review. So out of all of the lenses, the Sigma lens is by far the cheapest. But if we just have a look at the Canon lenses, the 500mm really jumps out in price. I just think because it's not as specialized. I think the 400mm 2.8 offers a 2.8 aperture and the 600mm offers a great kind of distance, but this is a kind of a middle ground between the two. It hasn't got the brightest aperture, it hasn't got the furthest reach, And I think just because of the supply and demand, not everybody's after a 500mm, it just offers a great value for money. And out of all of the lenses today, I think it's the one that I personally would recommend if price is really important to you. So because of that, I'm actually going to be giving it a solid mark. I'm going to be giving it a 6 out of 10 for price. Sure, it's not the most cheapest lens in the world, but out of all the primes, it's probably the best value for money. Right, so that's time of the video where we look at the pros and cons to really work out, is this 500mm really worth a spot in your camera bag? And let's have a look at the pros first. So first up, this lens offers amazing build quality. Doesn't matter where you take this lens, if you're taking it near a waterfall, you're taking it in the desert or even the Arctic, this lens is going to perform amazing simply because of that amazing build quality. You also get a hard case with this lens, so if you are taking it traveling, if you're taking it abroad or anything like that, you know this lens is going to be safe while traveling because of that great hard case. You're also going amazing image quality, razor sharp images and beautiful background separation thanks to that f4 aperture. You're also getting great bokeh because of that 9-bladed rounded aperture diaphragm. Again, coupled with that beautiful f4 aperture, you're going to get stunning images which just wouldn't be possible with a zoom lens. This lens is also the lightest out of the 400, 500 and 600mm prime lenses. So if size and weight is an issue, this 500mm is far better than the 400 or 600mm primes. This lens is also the cheapest out of the 3 prime lenses compared to the 400 or 600mm. You can save up to £2,500 just simply buying this 500mm prime lens. So as you can see, there's a decent amount of pros, but let's have a look at a few cons and work out if maybe another lens is worth a spot in your camera bag. This lens is heavy. There's no way of getting around it. Sure, it's not the heaviest, but it's nowhere near the lightest. And if you are, size and weight is a major issue, maybe a zoom lens might be better suited. That hunting AF could sometimes be a little bit annoying. So buying a dedicated mirrorless lens for a mirrorless camera, like for example, the RF 100-500, would mean you're getting faster autofocus. Again, it's not slow, but it's definitely not the fastest I've seen. Also, that minimum focus distance of just 3.7 meters can be quite frustrating in some environments. If you're photographing whales or things in the far distance, it's never going to be a problem. But if you're focusing on very close subjects, like for example, red squirrels, I did find that minimum focus distance quite frustrating. And lastly, it's a very, very, very expensive lens. Sure, it's not as expensive as a 600mm or 400mm, but that's like saying, oh, my Porsche is cheaper than a Ferrari. But it is still a very expensive car, so it doesn't matter how you get around it, this lens is a very expensive lens and far out of reach of most photographers. And there we go guys, so there is my lens review of the Canon EF 500mm f4 Mark II. Now would I recommend this lens? Well, it really depends. If you're looking at buying a super telephoto prime lens, like the 400, 500 or 600mm prime lenses, then this is the lens I would recommend over the other two, for the major reason of price. It gives you so much better value for money while still offering the same image quality and roughly the same focal range. Sure, the 400mm gives you that amazing aperture of f2.8 and the 600mm gives you a little bit of extra reach, but to be honest with you, that value for money really does offset those two, as well as it's being a little bit smaller and also the lightest out of all of these lenses. So traveling, carrying it, going from location to location, it's just that little bit easier. And it's the lens that I personally would recommend out of all of the prime lenses. But would I recommend it versus a zoom? Well, for travel, maybe not. But if you're a dedicated, maybe you're always shooting in a hide and you haven't got to carry it very far, then that's when the prime lens really comes into play, offering that amazing aperture. Maybe you're shooting in the woodlands or things like that, then that's when I really would recommend a prime lens. But for everything else, for traveling and everything like that, for being a little bit more versatile, a zoom lens is always going to be that little bit more versatile. But it really depends on which zoom. Maybe a Sigma 150-600, I'd recommend that one, or the Canon RF 100-500. I'd love to do a lens review between a prime and a zoom, so if you're interested in that, make sure to write it down in the comments below. But yeah, highly recommend this lens to any photographer that wants to get exceptional image quality while not spending an absolute fortune on a super telephoto prime lens. And coming in with an overall score of 42 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens to have in your camera bag. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.